2018 marks the centenary of the First World War. Dubbed the War to End All Wars, it forever changed the world in which we live in today. The 20th century was one of the most conflict-ridden periods of human history. It also was marked by advancements in technology, strategy, and weaponry. Toxic gases, the airplane, the tank, the machine gun, trench warfare all made their marks on those who experienced their power and brutality.
Dès le 24 juin 1914, l'Europe était embrasée de disputes territoriales, une course aux armements et de tensions à caractère ultranationaliste, à l'avènement de tragédies et destructions. Après l'assassinat du prince héritier Franz Ferdinand et l'échec des négociations diplomatiques, la guerre est devenue l'option de choix de grandes puissances européennes. Un empire européen et leurs colonies après l'autre se mobilisent et se préparent à une guerre jamais vue auparavant. Étant un dominion britannique, le Canadien et les Canadiens de toute région et origine se sont engagés dans la guerre.
We've all learned of battles like Passchendaele and Vimy Ridge, and of the contributions of heroes like Billy Bishop, Arthur Currie, and John McCrae. However, today, we will tell you the stories of lesser-known heroes, stories that have been overlooked, lost, and almost forgotten. Stories of ordinary men and women much like you and I, who had hopes and dreams, but had their lives interrupted by war. You will hear stories that are diverse and unique, like the individuals who experienced them. Stories that represent the diversity that did and still does exist in Canada today.
We begin with the story of Norman Ross. To many of us, war is often nothing more than a part of history. We fail to realize the realities and impacts of war on both soldiers and civilians, its effects on those involved and how it changes them, as well as the memory and feeling they carry for the rest of their lives. Many choose not to share those realities, even with the ones that they care about most. One such example is Norman Ross. Ross survived the Great War, living until the age of 90. In Ross's final years, he enjoyed spending his time most with his grandchildren. He would take them out to ice cream, play hockey games, and do so much more. But one thing he avoided talking about was his time as a gunner with Canada's 8th Battalion at Ypres. It was only after Ross's death in 1972 that his grandchildren stumbled upon his diary and learned about their great-grandfather's role in the war. His diary began in 1915. Initially, Ross struggled adapting to brutal conditions, sights, and sounds of being at the front. On March 6, 1915, he wrote,
"We marched about 5 miles to a barn where we were billeted. It was a very dark night, and we were falling over each other. I fell in a shell hole and got plastered with mud and water. We were all very tired."
March 9th, 1915, he wrote,
"Last night, we took our turn. All the buildings around here have been badly shelled. This morning, a shot came through the door where I had been standing for 10 or 15 minutes only a few seconds before. It has been very cold the last few days. Had quite a snowstorm yesterday. Froze very hard last night. Have had several snowstorms since we landed."
Ross detailed his experiences extensively in the trenches at Ypres, Belgium, where Canadians saw battle for the first time. On March 12, 1915, he wrote,
"We stood from 5:30 to 6 a.m. Today, we were in trenches near our billet. Our big guns behind us were doing a lot of firing today. Shells were flying over us, thick and fast, making an awful noise."
A stalemate ensued for the rest of March and most of April, with little progress made by either side of the war. Things changed on April 22nd when the German army for the first time used the world's deadliest weapons to date, capable of killing thousands at a time: chemical weapons.
It was fairly quiet until 4:30 p.m. when German aeroplanes started flying over us and started a very heavy artillery fire on our trenches. We had several casualties. I was struck by several pieces of shrapnel.
One of Ross's final entries came as he was recovering from injuries sustained at Ypres and the horrors of experiencing chemical warfare firsthand.
"Well, here I am in England, slightly wounded in my right hip and side from shrapnel. A shell bursting almost on top of me, and it is miraculous how I got off so lucky. I'm also suffering a little from the effects of the gas which was thrown at us. And my condition would have been much worse had I not had my nose and mouth covered with my handkerchief."
Ross eventually returned home to Canada, where he stayed for the remainder of the war. Chlorine gas, a weapon that would define the inhumane tactics and weapons used during the war. Being the first victims of gas attacks, the Canadians improvised, using urine-soaked handkerchiefs as makeshift gas masks. The Canadians dug in and withheld German advance, gaining praise from both allies and enemies alike. The legend of Canadian stormtroopers was born at Ypres. In all, 6,035 Canadians, 1 man in every 3, became casualties at Ypres, of whom more than 2,000 died. Ross's story is one of courage, fear, and resilience. It should serve to us a reminder of what war truly is and the impact it carries on all people.
Next, we hear the story of Francis Pagamagabo. Francis was 25 when he joined the army in the summer of 1914. After serving in 4 major battles, Pagamagabo became known as the most highly decorated First Nations soldier to serve in the Great War. In the Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, and the Somme, Pagamagabo was titled the most effective sniper to serve in the entire First World War, leading to a promotion to Lance Corporal. Pagamagabo's left leg was injured during the Battle of the Somme, but he had recovered and was able to return to his battalion as they moved on to Belgium. It was during this time that Pagamagabo was granted the military medal for his scouting job in both the Second Battle of Ypres and the Battle of the Somme. Pagamagabo's service in the Second Battle of Passchendaele was commended by his superiors, and in turn he was awarded a bar to his military medal. Later in the Battle of the Scarpe, Pagamagabo became one of 39 Canadians to receive a second bar to his military medal when he braved machine gun fire to run across no man's land and recover ammunition for his post. When the war ended in November of 1918, Pagamagabo was sent back to Canada, but by the time of his discharge, he had attained the rank of Sergeant Major and he had been awarded the 1914 15 Star, the British War Medal, and the Victory Medal.
Upon Pagamagabo's return home to the Parry Island Band, he faced challenges with the Department of Indian Affairs and struggled to gain their respect, especially for Indigenous soldiers who have fought overseas. Equal on the battlefield, but not at home, proclaimed advocates like Pagamagabo, who fought for the rights of his people until his death in 1952. A First Nations soldier who served Canada for the entirety of the war was stripped of his Indian status for being off a reserve for 4 consecutive years. Pagamagabo did more than just serve his country at war. He fought for justice and equality. In his honor, the 3rd Canadian Patrol Group HQ building was named after him. He also became a member of the Indian Hall of Fame at the Woodland Centre in Brantford, Ontario. And a 2-scale bronze statue of him was erected on National Aboriginal Day on June 21, 2016. The efforts and contributions of Indigenous Canadians in the Great War and afterwards in the pursuit of a better Canada have gone unrecognized for very long. Francis Pagamagabo and so many like him deserve their due.
Next, we look at Wee Tan and Wee Hong Louis, 2 brothers who served Canada despite the racism and discrimination they faced before the war. When war broke out in 1914, the Canadian government refused to allow those of Chinese heritage to fight in order to deny them citizenship once the war was over. Despite being refused full citizenship under the Exclusion Act, the Louis brothers fighting for Canada was nothing short of astonishing. In 1917, Wee Tan was rejected when he attempted to volunteer in Kamloops, British Columbia because he wasn't white. This led him to buying a horse in the dead of winter and trekked across the Rockies to Calgary, where in February of 1918 he was enlisted in Calgary's 10th Canadian Infantry Battalion and was sent to France to witness the worst of battles. He served as a runner delivering messages where he was often exposed to enemy fire. In the final year of the war, Canadians like Wee Tan were involved in the war's final campaigns. Between August 8th to November 11th, nearly 100,000 Canadians endured the 100 Days campaign to end when the armistice ended all fighting. The Canadian Corps suffered 45,835 casualties during this offensive. Wee Tan was wounded and suffered a lifelong hearing loss as a result of shell fire. In March 1919, he returned to Canada, and on a trip to Vancouver, he met his wife, Lillian Louis. Lillian Louis has fond memories of her husband.
He never talked about it to the children or anyone, so I don't know too much about it. I know he got hurt and they sent him home. After the war, he did a lot of different things, a lot of different jobs. He drove taxi in Portland and worked in the Caribou, and when we lived in Ashcroft, he did trucking. My husband was very good, very kind, very good to his children.
Today, The Louis brothers stand for all those unknown warriors that refuse to seek safety behind what might have been considered a convenient aspect of racism, their exemption from conscription. The life stories of We 10 should be remembered because it encapsulates the struggles and triumphs of Chinese Canadians in British Columbia during the past 120 years.
I was the first Chinese Canadian woman to vote because my husband was in the war.
Lillian shared, the Expulsion Act was eventually repealed due to the effort of Chinese Canadians in the armed forces. The brothers were among the 300 or so Chinese Canadians believed to have volunteered to fight in the First World War, but about whom very little is known.
Our final story follows Evelyn McKay, a young woman from Cambridge, Ontario. Evelyn McKay wore a blue dress and a white veil while she cared for wounded soldiers near the Western Front. Soldiers had a nickname for nurses like her, a bluebird. Evelyn worked as a nurse at a military hospital in Toronto before enlisting in 1916 and following her brother overseas. She was 23.
McKay held the rank of nursing sister. During the Great War, 3,141 Canadian nurses served. They worked at hospitals and at medical stations. During the war, nurses had much to do. The war killed or maimed soldiers by the millions, inflicting horrific injuries. Medical conditions could be primitive, leaving nurses to battle rats and fleas while also dodging bombs. While nurses were kept away from the battlefields, they were sometimes in the range of artillery or air raids.
McKay worked at No. 3 Canadian General Hospital at Boulogne on the French coast. Almost all soldiers who reached No. 3 hospital survived. Soldiers in worse shape died on the battlefield or at casualty clearing stations located near the front lines. At casualty stations, doctors conducted a grim triage, separating men who might be saved from men who were deemed too badly wounded. Those who might be saved were given priority for care. By October 1918, the Allies had the Germans on the run. However, fighting on the Western Front was still fierce. McKay's hospital was further burdened by an outbreak of Spanish flu that killed millions around the world. A dozen nurses, including McKay, fell ill in October 1918 as influenza hit.
Evelyn died at the age of 25 on November 4, 1918, a week before the war officially ended. Now, Evelyn McKay is in France forever, buried in a British military cemetery. Canada has honored her and other bluebirds with the memorial inside the Parliament building in Ottawa. The story of women is often forgotten in the battlefield narrative, as countries mourn the loss of hundreds of thousands of young men. But the bravery, determination, and hard work of Evelyn and her fellow bluebirds lives on.
L'armistice met fin à tous les combats dans les airs, sur les mers et sur les champs de bataille à 11h, heure de Paris, le 11 novembre 1918. Malgré le fait que l'armistice met fin au combat de la guerre, le traité de Versailles signé le 28 juin 1919 détermina les conditions de paix et de la capitulation des forces des empires centraux. L'héritage de la Première Guerre mondiale est d'avoir mené à la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, la guerre de Corée, du Vietnam et à tant d'autres conflits au XXe siècle. Si ce n'était pas des sacrifices de ceux qui ont combattu pour nous, nous ne connaîtrions pas la paix, justice et liberté dont nous jouissons aujourd'hui.
The sacrifices made by Canadians, such as Norman Ross, the Louis brothers, Evelyn McKay, and Francis Pegamabeau, should remain with us forever. Unfortunately, many stories of sacrifice, bravery, and dedication are lost and forgotten. It is our duty as Canadians living in the freedom that so many fought to keep to honor and remember their stories. A person isn't dead until they are forgotten.
Remembrance Day is an opportunity for Canadians to reflect upon who we remember and what lessons we can learn from the men and women who served Canada and have first-hand experience in war and conflict. We invite you today to think deeply about the immeasurable costs of war, the sacrifices made for freedom, and to honor the memory of those men and women who served Canada. Please observe a minute of silence.